We will have two presenters now. Ákos is the CTO at Shapr3D and a former engineering director at Skyscanner. He has over 10 years of experience in scaling engineering organizations and building successful products. Previously, he co-founded Distinction and served as its CTO until it was acquired by Skyscanner in 2014. Seb is the VP of Product at Shapr3D, where he is working with the team to create software that helps manufacturing teams design and make amazing products with less friction. Before joining as Shapr3D's first product manager, Seb was the director of product management at Prezi. The title of their talk is Leveraging Constructive Tension, a Path to Building Outstanding Products. First, please welcome on stage Seb, Cachia with a huge round of applause.
Hi everyone. Hands up if you can hear me well. Cool, thanks so much. This setup is definitely tension-inducing. I've presented a fair amount of times before, but never with this kind of setup. So first time for everything. So skip this slide. So today, Ákos, my colleague, and I are going to be talking a little bit about how to best leverage tension in the workplace to create astounding products. I'll start by giving a little bit of context about Shapr3D so you can understand the space within which we operate. Ákos will talk a little bit about the philosophy behind our thoughts on this and our culture. I'll close off with processes that help encourage this and bringing us home with a short summary. So, what is Shapr3D doing? So Shapr3D is a Hungarian company based out of Budapest, Hungary. We're relatively young, founded in 2015, and we've got about 110 employees, all based out of Budapest here. And we've raised about 21 million in VC funding from some of the some top European VCs that have been behind companies you might have heard of, like Revolut and Spotify and Zendesk. And we've got about 40,000 paying customers to date. And Shapr3D is a design tool that is trying to create the best possible experience for product design and manufacturing teams, helping them remove friction from their workflow so that they can create better products. And we're a cross-platform product. We're available on iPad, macOS, and Windows. And we cover three major parts of the workflow: 3D modeling, 2D drawing, and visualization. And just a little bit of context, I said product manufacturing companies. This is really a quite broad industry. So even though CAD might be to many a somewhat unrelatable segment, a tool which we might not have used day to day outside of hardware engineering, mechanical engineering, it's still a relatively broad category. And basically, if you look around yourselves in this room, most of what you see was manufactured and at some point in time designed in CAD. So CAD has this really interesting broad impact on the world around us. Everything we touch, everything we use, everything we buy was at some point in time designed in CAD. And this includes everything from cars to plastic bottles. And this obviously has implications on the product because, as you can imagine, designing a car and designing a plastic bottle is quite a different experience. And each of these kinds of products come with a relatively complex workflow, but internally we like to simplify it into these three steps. You're designing something, you're engineering it, and then you're manufacturing that. And that's what takes you from idea to a finished product. And what CAD is doing basically is it's mostly solving for that engineering step. And even though CAD officially stands for computer-aided design, internally we like to joke that it should stand for computer-aided documentation. So it's not actually a tool which is optimized to design things. Instead, it is a tool which is built for the rigors of documentation when you are spending a lot of money building something physical. And one of the interesting things about Shapr3D is that because of our ease of use and our cross-platform support, we actually find ourselves solving much more broadly for the entire step funnel here. So going from design through engineering and actually manufacturing too. And CAD is actually a space with quite a rich history. If you're interested in this, we actually have a multi-part, quite long blog post, which you can dive into. But a very short summary on this is that basically in the 60s at MIT, there was this PhD project called Sketchpad, which was quite influential. So much so that it was actually the first system with a GUI of sorts, and it was the inspiration behind the work which went on in Xerox PARC subsequently. And in the 80s, we saw some of the first real large-scale commercial applications. A Russian gentleman created this new technology called parametric modeling, which basically let you define a 3D model in the sequence of steps that was taken to create it. And a company was founded around this called PTC. The P in PTC stands for parametric. And PTC became this massively successful company selling CAD for mainframe computers. At that point in time, a CAD seat would cost you, anywhere from a couple of hundred of thousands of dollars. And a few years after that, in the 90s, there was this revolutionary new computing trend called the desktop computer. And a company called SolidWorks decided to leverage this opportunity. If Windows is talking about putting a computer on every desk in America, what if we put CAD in the hands of every single engineer in America? So SolidWorks basically leveraged this new trend in computing and said, okay, we're going to be able to run on desktop computers, we'll use GUIs in a really significant way, and will be way cheaper. So instead of hundreds of thousands of dollars, SolidWorks used to sell for tens of thousands of dollars. So it was a real bargain. And basically what we see is that this was the last major seismic shift in the CAD industry. And if you look at CAD from the 90s and the early 2000s and you look at CAD today, it hasn't really changed that much. Of course, CAD, because of this massive implication it has on the world around us, there are a couple of quite successful companies operating in the space. You might have heard of a couple of these. We split the CAD market up into enterprise, mid-market, and prosumer. And at the top end of the market, Siemens and Dassault Systems are two of the large players. Siemens, you might know from because they basically manufacture everything. They're the largest German manufacturing company, and they do everything from trains to nuclear power plants to fridges. And Dassault Systems is basically the Siemens of France, and amongst other things, they create the Eurofighter. And they have their own CAD systems oriented at the top of the market. PTC, I've already mentioned, is a multi-billion-dollar public company. SolidWorks was acquired by Dassault Systems. And Autodesk is a company you've probably heard of. They are more dominant in the architecture and construction space than in product manufacturing, but they are also a multi-billion-dollar public company. So what Shapr3D is doing is basically taking this space, which is incredibly technically complex, going up against companies who have a 40-year head start, who have very deep pockets, and who have a very strong brand recognition. We're doing so with a product space that is very highly technical, very, very complex, and very deep. And this is something which is very demanding on talent. It's very demanding on engineering. We like to joke that many engineers learn a lot of things at university, which they find completely useless. They never get to use those units that they have at university. At Shapr3D, you have a tendency of needing to use those kinds of things. And it's similarly challenging for designers, product managers, and similar. So that's a little bit of the space of why Shapr3D has this really challenging problem ahead of us. I'll hand over to Ákos to talk a little bit about how we think about approaching this.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? That's cool. So, as Seb has explained, it's quite exciting to work in an industry that basically hasn't changed in 30 years. It's like very few people or very few companies have even tried to disrupt this industry. So it definitely has some complexities we have to deal with. However, you might think these complexities lie in mathematics, in software engineering design, as Seb has explained. However, how I would explain is more about the people problem. There's a quote that I usually use in many of my presentations. Ben Horowitz, who is a famous VC guy, mentioned this at a certain point in his presentation. And when you are small, there are a lot of different things that are very trivial to do. These are communication, knowledge sharing, decision making. However, when you start to become big, these simple things start to become really, really difficult. And in Shapr, despite, as I mentioned, we solve a lot of problems, like the things that we studied at the university and thought nobody's going to use that anymore, all the things that we studied there is still used in Shapr every day. However, the biggest problems we are solving is basically how we make people work together very efficiently so they can make high quality decisions. And one of the concepts that we internalize in Shapr is basically we have a lot of people. This organization is not massive in size. We have around 110 people, but still big enough to make a lot of complexity around decision making and knowledge sharing. And what we think of as a solution is that we think of the whole problem set as we have a lot of people and all of these individuals has their own depth of knowledge in their field, and we have to make sure that these people can work together and make a really good decision. There isn't anyone, if we remove from the equation, the knowledge will be equally useful and helpful. So there's always a need for more and more people to collaborate, to share knowledge, to decide on the certain aspects of a problem, to make good quality decisions. And this is where tension comes in as a really useful exercise. Some people say tension is more like a necessity. Some people say it's more like the tool. Sometimes people just want to avoid tension, but they want to have the fruits of the tension that exists. But how I see is that if there are people who want to work together, and there's a lot of use cases when these people have different perspectives. There's a designer, there's a software engineer, and they want to align on like how to build that product. And definitely they not necessarily agree on all the things that they think. They have their own perspective and want to make sure that they can reach a consensus, because eventually we have to build something together. And there are two ways of solving this and reaching a consensus. One is through hierarchy. So there is an easy way of like there is a hierarchy, there is someone whose decision is taken more seriously. Usually this is called in some ways like waterfall, when we go through a channel and the big decisions are decided in the front. Sometimes people talk about this like having an equal seat at the table. However, we stretch this to the extreme and we say that we want all people to be part of the decision. They have a voice. They can challenge, they can argue, they can ask questions on why we landed on this decision. And this has definitely some byproducts, some implication in terms of how the dynamics play out in a room. And one of the things are tension. However, we feel this tension is useful. It's useful because this is the way how people actually make a change. Whenever there is two opinionated people try to align on something, there is energy there. Like if the decision is easy, probably that wasn't even a decision. So therefore, there's a lot of energy, a lot of learning, a lot of practice, a lot of preparation to make sure that these people can work together. There is also a side effect of feedback. So whenever you have a room full of people who have different aspects of the problem, you just have a conversation, you immediately share feedback about the problem because you ask questions, you don't know why that engineer landed on that conclusion, and you ask a question, and by asking that question, you basically give a feedback to the individual. And it also forces you to think about how you need to explain the problem to others, because they are not engineers, they are not speaking the same language, but still, you have to explain, otherwise there is no way to collaborate really effectively. And one of the base ground for all this conversation is user. Because there is one single thing across all the different functions that basically unites all them together, is that we want to build together something really extraordinary for our customers. So it's very common that you sit in a meeting where designer, product manager, quality assurance individuals, like a lot of smart people sit there, and the question is like, how is that going to help the customer? And this is the ground base for all the discussion, and it helps to always solve problems that matters for the customer. However, there's a catch to everything. As I mentioned, when you have a lot of tension, you have a lot of disagreement, a lot of criticism, it's not easy. Like I hear a lot of, like remember hearing a lot of voices in the room, like I wish, like there's a guy, like a really senior software engineer, and he mentioned to me, and he's like, I don't know, 4 months. Like, I really wish Ákos, it's like I had this kind of authority. When I tell something, people just listen, because I know that like I am the most senior here. And I had to explain to him, like, you can't do this here. Like, you have to explain with reasoning. Like, if you just tell and the people just disagree, but they do because you said it, it won't matter, because then eventually they won't do the same thing that you wanted to explain to them. It's always much more difficult to explain with context, with reasoning, and make sure people align, because otherwise it's just, you have the perception that people understood the problem. And this can be exhaustive, this can be difficult, this can be hard to people. And also the other side is, it takes a lot of time. Like, there were reasons why people invented hierarchy in company, and I don't want to picture our organization there isn't a hierarchy. There's a lot of hierarchy there, and there's a lot of seniority there, and a lot of senior people make a lot of tough decisions. However, this is there to make sure that we can make the right decision in time. And when you involve a lot of people, 20 people, 100 people to make a good decision, it's inevitably going into a direction where it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. So it is also not great when you end up balancing that you want to make great decisions, but you also want to make them really efficient and really in a really fast way. So there's this dilemma: should we do one or should we do the other? Should we focus more in having more people involved, or should we exclude them so we can be fast and more effective? And what we do in terms of the balance, as I mentioned, and fundamentally, we believe that involving people, having a lot of voice, having all the people heard, and they have an opportunity to challenge, is an important part of our culture. But we also do a lot of different things that make sure that there is a healthy balance. One of the things is our shared mission. Like, we are building a revolutionary CAD software that nobody managed to build in the last 30 years. We want to change an industry, and that takes time. But at the same time, we have to be very confident that we make progress day by day. Otherwise, we can get lost in details, and then we end up in another 30 years not solving the problems we want to solve. We also set really aggressive timelines in a lot of cases, because if there are no constraints, you can end up not solving the problem. You feel that you make forward, but at the end, it's just like you're killing time and killing money altogether. And also, as I mentioned, it is also challenging for people having this kind of criticism, all the discussion, a lot of work and energy on explaining things that seems like obvious from your perspective, but from the other perspective doesn't look like obvious. And we are making sure that we hire the people who are basically trained for this. They are looking for this and really looking for the opportunity to grow together. We believe there is a lot of knowledge that we don't acquired yet, and it is best possible through working together and solving great problems along the line. I also have some aspects, like I covered this kind of tension and why we believe it's important, but let me cover some of the aspects that make it possible in Shapr. I wrote a quote from Phil Jackson. Phil Jackson is a famous NBA player. He also a very famous manager, used to be of Chicago Bulls, and we won a lot of league titles. And what he said is that the strength of the team is each individual member, but also the strength of each member is the team itself. And this is really something that resonates us all day. And one of the fundamental principles that we basically look for people whenever we hire them, whenever we see how they can contribute to our mission, how they can be successful in Shapr, is curiosity. It feels like simple, like people are born to be curious. Like, kids are running all around the place, and then they observe the nature of how they work and how they can change those things. However, we want to put this to the extreme. What we look for people in Shapr is that they have this kind of intrinsic motivation, where they don't look for someone to push them to learn. They automatically do this. Like, whenever there is something that is not obvious, they build a software and it gets broken, and then they try different things, and then suddenly it works again. They don't stop there. They're like, okay, we are happy because the problem is gone. They try to understand what caused the problem, so they learn from that. Whenever there is an input from a different function of did you consider this aspect when you landed on the solution? And when this is new to you, usually people in Shapr are like, okay, tell me more about that. Tell me what was it. Give me more context so I can also understand. This is inevitably leading into braining a real set of knowledge. And despite we also expect people to build up the depth of knowledge, we also see people to really widen the knowledge in terms of different function and different across disciplines, and it's just remarkable to see how people grow in this journey. We also ask a lot of questions, like whenever we don't know, like whether it's a Q&A, whether it's a meeting, whether it's anything, people are there to ask questions. And then unless they understand the reasoning, they continue to ask questions. And we also have to educate people to do this, because sometimes it's just, okay, should I ask the question? It might be so trivial. But asking question is also, as I mentioned, is a good tool to give feedback to the presenter, to the individual. And first and last but not least is like we have to respect. I mentioned we have a lot of different disciplines. There are algorithms experts, there are people working in marketing, there are people working in support, but they also have their own depths of expertise, and that those experts are not known by other people. And in order to make a good use, we have to really work together and respect them as individuals. The other aspect of the culture is being pragmatic. This is probably one of the most difficult parts to explain to other people who are not part of Shapr or like haven't worked in an organization and pragmatic. We usually can better describe what are the outcomes, what are the attributes, the behavior of a pragmatic culture, but this is basically the fundamental piece of how people cross-functionally work together. We never think of beliefs, or like the sentence that you don't hear in Shapr is like, this is how we used to do things. Like, that is not an answer. Like, is it good to use that method, or is it not good for this context? Probably the same thing, like the same process, the same routine that we use for another thing, probably completely useless for the thing that you do today. And this sentence, like, this is how it is, has always been. This is not something we use. This is really an attribute of a pragmatic culture, because what you do is basically you evaluate of the certain context, and you have to try to find a solution that is really specific to that. And it's hard. It's sometimes time-consuming. It's sometimes difficult to not follow something that you used to do, and always have an answer to these questions. And also, something where we are reluctant is like follow processes. One of the things that like larger growing organizations do is like whenever there is a failure, someone didn't manage to release a healthy software, like what the easiest thing to do is, okay, let's introduce a process so that doesn't happen again. Well, this is just not sustainable. You end up creating processes and processes, and the people will not even like remember those. It gives you a feeling of accomplishment, because okay, there was a problem, so I have to do something, so I write a process, so I solve the problem. In reality, usually you are not solving a problem, you just put a plaster on it and then you move ahead. So we try to have as few processes as possible, and instead we focus on the learning. So whenever we face a similar problem, or a problem that has a similar root cause, we can immediately realize this early on and not step in the same problem again and again. The other part is, again, quite controversial, as Shapr's brand and employer brand is usually perceived, is strong opinion is loosely held. So in order to this culture to really be successful, you have to have opinions. Quite easily, when you have this kind of notion where you want people to work together, you can immediately translate to this, like we go in a room with 15 people and we brainstorm. Like we go there and then all the people just like give a lot of ideas. Probably we do sometimes brainstorming, and we sometimes use sticky notes, and sometimes we just try to find different ideas. But that is more like the rare case. What we do is people come in prepared. They tell their story. They tell like how they imagine this to operate. And there are people observing, trying to process, and then they challenge, they question. It's very rare that where people come in without an opinion. It's quite useful to see when you come in a room and when it's clearly nobody has an opinion. What we want to see, and what we see in a lot of cases, is people just leave the room and say like, hey, like let's go back to the drawing board and figure out what we can do, because just sitting in a room and then sharing ideas is not going to help. So we really respect opinions, especially if they are built up through reasoning, where there is a really strong fundamental explanation of why we landed on that conclusion. But we also want people to be really flexible on this. So whenever we get a new perspective, they learn something from how the user perceived. They look through a user test that we recorded. They review the notes. They go into the data. They are open to change their perspective. And the more senior you are, probably the more reasons you have to why you landed on that decision. It's more difficult to basically change you from that perspective. But we expect leaders to also be flexible in this regard. And when there are new options coming in, then you are flexible to react to those changes. So I wanted to give a bit of an overview of how we work, how the culture looks like, and why we believe tension is a useful asset for us to operate. And Seb is going to continue give you more practical things that we do day by day, and how we operate this organization, and what are the things that create good value for us to create extraordinary products day by day, week by week. Thank you.
So in trying to come up with a couple of different ways to codify these ideas around culture, which Ákos was talking about, one of the places which we looked for inspiration for this cross-company set of operating principles is actually, I think, a world which is much more familiar to people coming from a scientific background. And there's this set of norms, the Mertonian norms of modern science, which some of you might have come across, which establish these 4 principles for how to ensure that decisions are made in a healthy way. And what is necessary is open access to information, universal standards of judgment, selfless interest, so no self-interest, so rather than being selfish, always optimizing for the greater good, and a system of organized skepticism. And this is something which we're constantly evaluating our processes with and trying to figure out how we can more effectively codify these kinds of ideas. And one example of this is the way we plan our work. So we've gone through a couple of different iterations on how we plan and how we establish OKRs, how we work together, how we make sure that product and engineering are together collaborating to figure out roadmaps and commitments and stuff like that. And one of the systems that seems to be working really, really well is actually a system where we're going through this W shape at the top over here. So the idea is that basically this helps us balance out between top-down insight and bottom-up insight. This is a process which begins from the executive team, so Ákos, myself, our CEO, we are setting context for the organization around the goals, the business strategy, the overall product strategy. And this is something which is challenged. So I quite literally put out a document which is read by product managers and engineers and data scientists, and they challenge me on it. They call me out on mistakes I make, they challenge assumptions, they question things. And when we feel that that has gotten to a point where it seems reasonable, it is then the team's turn to look at the context they have bottom up, their understanding of the technology and what's feasible, their understanding of more nuanced user needs by talking directly to users in their area, and they come up with plans. So bottom up, there are plans which are responses to this top-down context. And they are presented as saying, hey, for these business goals, here is a way that we think we should work towards those. And this is then something which is submitted in quite an open way to be challenged. It is challenged by the other teams, so every team is looking at their own work, looking at the adjacent work, and trying to figure out how things will fit together, how dependencies will be resolved, how this contributes to the greater good. And it's also something which the executive team looks at and challenges and questions. And we go through a process of integration. And at that point in time, we might have surfaced a couple of action items. They tend to be quite concrete. And teams are then aligned through this process of constructive conflict in what they're going to work on, and they're bought into that. At the end of one of these cycles, we have a process which we call the cycle kickoff. Generally, it's quarterly. Recently, we did a summer kickoff, though. And the idea here is that once this core group has figured out the plans, the whole company gets together and we talk about these. And I think one of the things that makes it particularly relevant to call out as an example in this particular context is that at the end of this, we have a lengthy open Q&A section. And basically, this is a point in time where everyone is invited to ask any kinds of questions. They're invited to challenge the plans. They're invited to ask questions about culture, about what has been prioritized, what hasn't been. And what you can see on the right-hand side here is literally the CEO, members of the executive team, senior product managers, all sitting down there together and answering questions in front of the whole company. At the beginning of the planning cycle, we run something called a planning offsite. And what this is a deep dive into the upcoming plans and the opportunity to resolve some of those questions which I was talking about earlier. A really important part of this is actually that everyone does their homework up ahead, and similar to what you would have in the scientific community where you're publishing a paper for peer review, everyone is publishing their plans to the other cross-functional teams. And what you see on the left-hand side here is literally questions which are coming up from those documents and from the subsequent presentation of them, which are then prioritized and formed into working groups to resolve any misalignment. And by the end of this offsite, what we end up with is, on the right-hand side here, a set of open questions which we have proposals for, which the teams have resolved. So anyone who has strong opinions about this particular topic in either direction gets together, hashes these out in a very, very focused 1 to 2 hour discussion, and leaves the space having resolved the topic at hand. Once we have our plans, another process which we go through is something that we call the monthly product check-ins. And this is basically an opportunity for teams to be held accountable for the commitments which they make. And this is actually a very public meeting within the company. What you see here is actually a screenshot from the Slack post on a channel with everyone in the company in it, which is giving the information about it, the agenda, information on how to join. And basically anyone can sit into this, anyone can have an understanding of the progress that was made by the teams, of the plans for what's coming up next. And again, it is an opportunity to ask challenging questions in this venue and have things resolved as much as possible on the spot. And I kind of hinted at this a couple of different times, but really it's very tough to ask smart questions on the spot. And the way to get around this is to do a bunch of homework. And one of the ways we do this at Shapr3D is by making sure that a lot of important information is available to everyone. What you see on the top with the specific numbers blurred out is actually the daily KPIs report published on our core channel. So literally every single day, every single person in the company knows what our revenue numbers are, what our revenue growth is, how key performance indicators are performing. Bit too much. This information goes from this very high level, almost superficial level, to having full access to usage data and financial data from the company through our data stack. And then on the flip side, on the bottom, what you see is another part of our process, which is basically as we are going through planning, one of the very, very first steps is that the product teams must publish their plans again in a public channel. And this is again, first of all, an invitation for those plans to be read and commented upon. And what we then do is we organize a review meeting, which is attended by key participants of the product organization, the engineering organization, for those plans to then be challenged and discussed, and to make sure that we're aligned around what the key outcomes we want to have are. With that, bringing to a close this presentation, we are at Shapr3D strong advocates for creating these opportunities for constructive tension, to have the discussions which surface the entirety of the organization's brainpower. It's something that I would heavily recommend everyone to do it in their organizations. And you most definitely need to put in a fair amount of effort to figure out what system to utilize to make that work for you. Thanks so much, and reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you. We got some questions already. Who is the main culture advocate, the main culture holder in your company? CTO.
You can hear me, right?
Yeah. It's still on.
I definitely enjoy being involved in a lot of discussions that is around the culture. That's partly personally, partly because more than 50% of the organization is in engineering, so it's inevitably a significant portion of the organization. However, I believe it's mainly coming from the founding team, including the founder István and also the early employees who laid the foundation of the culture that already existed when I joined afterwards. And also basically everyone in the company. I don't like similar to how we are proud to solve problems together. We are also proud to invite everyone to form the culture. It is changing. It is not something static. It is not like constant for the past years, and it will change for sure. And we also try to learn, and we also try to adjust more when we see problems. But it's usually one of the most rewarding work when you are actually working on the culture, and that has a long-lasting impact on people in the organization.
All right, thank you very much. We got another question. Are cycle kickoffs more like retrospectives or prospective?
So they are actually a little bit of both. It is an opportunity for the company as a whole and every single product team to talk about what they accomplished over the prior 3 months. So circle back to any goals they committed to, any outputs they committed to. And it is an opportunity to talk about plans for the next 3 to 6 months. So it is looking backwards, what did we commit to last time and how did we do? And this is what we're talking about doing next over the next period, and this is why we're doing that.
All right, thank you. We have a new one. So have you experienced any drawbacks to sharing your usually sensitive financial data daily on a public forum internally?
No, I mean the reason why we still have it is that there wasn't a reason to not to have it. So it's just self-explanatory. There are obviously concerns and risk of this, which might come up, but so far at this size that has not been a problem. Once we get more mature in terms of size and also financially, maybe this is something that we reevaluate, but today we use this more as like giving context to people. And the questions that have come up more often is like, how can we give more context, not less context? So like, is this financial data in this perspective useful? How can we make it even more useful? How can we make sure that people can understand the context, not just the number? So there has been a lot more discussions around how to make sure people understand what's written there and how to react if there is a change, instead of like killing it completely.
All right. And that was our final question. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presentation and your answers. A round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.